Let's move into a little discussion about social marketing. Now, Porter Novelli was founded in 1972, and it credits itself as being the founder of social marketing. Could you tell us about that and share some specific campaigns that you were involved in that really focus in on the social good?
Okay. Bill Novelli, who was one of the three founders of Porter Novelli, really is credited, I think, in a large part with being the father, the pioneer of social marketing. He was actually an advertising guy, and also had worked in the Peace Corps along with Jack Porter and Bob Druckenmiller. But they took the principles that they had learned from the advertising business and they applied that into how can you use that to create social good? How can you use marketing to change people's behaviors and create a social good? So one of their first clients actually was the National Institute. It was the National Institute Health's high blood pressure education program. And at that time, Americans didn't really know even what the term hypertension was. And there were no treatments for it, really, but they were starting to emerge from the clinic. And the government felt, and it was a terrible problem, people were dying due to heart attack and stroke. So they hired Porter Novelli to put in place a social marketing program to change, not just to educate people about what hypertension was, but to change Americans' behaviors about getting tested, because now if you could get tested and you had to understand what it was you're looking for, so there was a number associated with that, your blood pressure reading, that you could track it, that there was a treatment for you that you could take that would help lower your high blood pressure. Also involved in that was better eating habits, more exercise. So a lot of different people could get involved, or groups could get involved in that effort, not just pharmaceutical companies or physician groups, but also groups that were interested in physical education, schools, whoever it might be. Over the length of that program, and I can't remember now the actual statistic, but a few years ago the government published a statistic on morbidity and mortality from heart attack, at least, and it was unbelievable in terms of how much it had fallen over that intervening period, thanks to a long-term education program, social marketing program, essentially. So that's, I think, a good example of how that's gotten used. Many of the social marketing programs, by the way, were for government entities or associations. They have been used a little bit by corporations, but typically they lend themselves better to associations and organizations who typically are going to have a little longer term view of things, I think, the ability to sustain it. One of the most famous programs was the Truth Campaign, which was for the state of Florida, when the state of Florida, like many states, received their compensation from the tobacco company settlements, and that money had to be used to help reduce the incidence of smoking among teenagers. They had whacked away at this problem for a while, and everybody would use the typical, arguments with teenagers, you're going to die. Yeah, maybe in 20 years when I'm old, not now. Or smoking makes you unattractive, I don't think so. All the cool kids in school smoke. So none of those were working, but what happened when we were brought into the campaign, we did some more research on teenagers to really understand what motivated them, and we found they did not trust business, big business. And in particular, they felt that tobacco companies were very manipulative. And that became the focal point for the campaign. Now, this is a good segue perhaps into social networking and social media. And so that campaign was designed by the teenagers with the help of Porter Novelli and the advertising agency. They also became the spokespeople, and they saw over a 2-year period, I think, a reduction of something like 40% in the incidence of smoking among teenagers. Now, back then, when they had the campaign, you had to use things like mailing videos to people. You had to actually have a physical town hall meeting. If you were going to have an event, you had to get flyers out. Today, if you could use the social media that we have at our disposal, you can only imagine how much more you could have compressed the timing of that campaign and probably had either the same amount of the same results in a shorter period of time or even better results. So it's a very good example of both, I think, the application of social marketing, but also how that can carry through and what happens when you start to use social networking, among peers, and then you overlay that with a technology. Today, if you had the campaign, you would just put that technology on top of it and use that.
Wow. Has the internet, the new media, the Twitter, the blogging, so forth, I think this is kind of an obvious question, but has it made public relations more or less ethical, and why?
I think that it should, in the end, that sort of begs the question as to whether or not public relations was unethical to begin with,
Right.
which I would say from a practice standpoint, I don't believe that to be the case. I have always believed, even before the advent of the internet in such a big way, that if you were doing some research for a company or a client, you were the PR person or the agency, and you were doing some competitive research, it would be patently wrong to call up a competitor and pretend, I'm a student, at X university, and I'm doing some, research on your company. Could you tell me about blah, blah, blah? I mean, a lot of people did that, and that's just wrong. I mean, that is not what our profession is about. I mean, one of the Page principles, the first one, tell the truth, right? So if you're predisposed to lie or to misrepresent yourself or your company, it doesn't matter, pre or post-internet, you're going to do that anyway. It's the same thing with Sarbanes-Oxley. If you were going to, like Enron, misrepresent and falsify and lie, cheat, and steal, essentially, Sarbanes-Oxley is not going to necessarily prevent that. That behavior will continue. So I think it's a sort of a behavioral issue. What I do think has changed is that due to all of the social media tools now to us, the transparency now is so much greater, and it's immediate. You really have no margin for error. There's, as we like to say, there's no place to hide. So actually that should be very liberating, and it should be very good for public relations. There are no more rocks that people can hide under, or if they can, not for very long. So I think what that has highlighted for our profession, however, is that we have to really be incredibly vigilant about transparency issues, not just the way we practice our craft, but for our organizations, whether they're our own companies or organizations that we work in, or whether we're agencies and work for them. I think that that is what has really changed, I think, forever the environment in which we operate in.
What are the abilities and characteristics that senior staff look for when they're interviewing potential employees? I mean, hopefully 10, 15 years down the road, scholars, but also some students are going to be looking at this. And
Okay.
what are the kinds of things that they should know, that they need to understand?
Well, I think certainly there's the technical part of our craft that changes. I mean, 20, 25 years ago, media pitching, for example, was an important skill. It isn't to say that that skill is not important in its current configuration today, and probably will look different again in 20, 25 years. Writing, I think, has always been, I can't imagine, won't continue to be important to us as in a profession. How you present yourself, how you present your ideas, those are important skill sets for our profession. I think there are others that are emerging. Perhaps they should have been as important 25 years ago, but I think that the skills for success in our profession are the ability to sort of see around the corners. We've been known as doers, we're the writers of the press materials or the statements, the messaging people. What we need to understand now in a much more integrated world, much more complex world, all the drivers that we have, the three main drivers that, the Page Society has identified between globalization, stakeholder empowerment, and the new media, or the, I'd like to think of it as social networking on steroids with the new media. But, those trends have really created a much more complicated environment for us, and the potential of public relations in that, I think, is huge. It's a great opportunity for us, but we have to really step up our game as professionals. You know, we can't just go in the corner and write our thing or send emails out or, you know, write the web page or whatever the current state is of the communication side. You know, we have to be leaders. We have to help motivate our companies. We have to participate as leaders, you know, earn our place, you know, as a senior leader and a function that is helping drive change or helping organizations deal with change. I think the current state of change that we see now, I don't know what that looks like in terms of history, but you know, they say that change keeps accelerating with each passing year or second or whatever. That's just going to continue, and I think the ability for our profession to help organizations deal with change and what that means in terms of their relationships with all the different constituents that they have to deal with in order to be successful is huge. And that requires a lot of those skills of listening, of being calm, of having a little sense of humor, of being self-aware, of being confident but not arrogant, of knowing what you don't know and not being afraid to say, I don't know, but I will take care of it. I mean, for us, the worst sin to you know, is to build a situation in which we're not trusted. You know, we say we'll do something and then we don't follow through. That's, I mean, that's sort of true of any job, I think. But particularly in our profession, we have, you know, such a high premium on trustworthiness that is incredibly important for our ability to survive. So we have to understand all the different stakeholders that an organization deals with. We're the only people really at the end of the day inside an organization that has that broad view. Nobody else has that, except maybe the CEO. And even then, you know, we're probably best suited to really help guide organizations through that. Does that mean that we run everything? No. Does that mean that, you know, the marketing function isn't, you know, just as important in a different way? No. But, you know, our role has to really be one of being the guide for that web of relationships that an organization has to develop and cultivate in order to be successful.
Well, is there anything else that you might want to share with us? Anything that we haven't touched on?
Other than, this is, you know, 2009. This would have, had I actually stayed at Porter Novelli this year, I would have been literally working in the business for 40 years. I still consider that I'm working. So 1969 was a seminal year from a societal standpoint, and so it's always amazing to see the changes. But in another 40 years, you know, the world's going to look very different, obviously, than it does today. But I like to think it's always been an exciting field, public relations, and it may be more complex now. It might be more difficult in some ways. But you certainly can never say that it isn't a lot of fun, that it isn't challenging. I mean, it is one of the most intellectually stimulating and emotionally satisfying fields, I think, to be working in. So I would just say I hope that in 40 years that is even more the case.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've given us.